Fuad, and of course our Myra Ashdan and Amir Taha for bringing our heavy equipment and taking care of us. Before I begin, I want to offer you a brief note, a word about musical notation. This is intended to be a general talk, something for which you do not need significant prior background in music, although obviously I hope that you are interested in music and that's why you're here. If you are not, unfortunate things may happen, we'll see. I am, however, going to throw up on the panel musical notation, which my expectation is that perhaps a significant number of you don't know how to read it. I hope that you will be able to hear the music and still make sense of my argument and make sense of what you hear. But I do want to take a moment and mention that if you don't read music, I hope you will still look at it and try to make intuitive sense of what it does. Western musical notation does in fact act intuitively as a sort of pleasing graphic that corresponds somehow to what we hear. So I'm just going to take literally 2 or 3 minutes and point out music is made up of sounds. When we use a sound in a piece of music, we call it a note. These notations here are notes written down, these black ovals. This last one, which has an unattached stem, is called a quarter note. When you take one of those and you connect them with a beam, they become 8 notes. 2 of them are as long as 1/4. When you put 2 beams, they are 16ths. 4 of them are as long as 1/4. What that means is that the shape of the note tells you how long it is. So that if you look at this, the rhythm, ba 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 ba. There will not be a quiz at the end of the period, I promise. However, it should, I think, make sense if you see it, if you follow it going from left to right, the way that it goes by. You note also that there is a graphic. There are 5 lines and 4 spaces. We call that a staff. And we indicate the pitch of the note by how it is located on the staff. So that in this particular instance, we have re, mi, fa, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re. You can watch the music going up and down on the staff as it goes by once again. If you have not read music before, I urge you to do it. It is an amazingly powerful technology, this thing where you take a piece of paper with markings on it and you look at the markings and you can sing or play a piece that you have never heard before. That is power, right? If you have an interest, I would urge you to consider taking a course called How to Read Music, which we offer. It is a 3-credit course. It's worth taking purely for the opportunity to take a course with Dr. Chelsea Green, my esteemed assistant. In any case, I'm going to take out my infernal machine and put the little airplane on it so that it doesn't disturb us. Actually worked on that. I urge you to like us. And I will begin. I want to start with the 30,000 feet up view of the matter and remark that music is in fact composed of sounds which are somehow organized so that it is the arrangement which adds a layer of meaning that would not otherwise be there. Something which is not inherent in the individual sounds. If you heard this sound, you might say, oh, listen to that, somebody is plucking a brass string. But if you were walking by one of our offices in the music building and you heard, I suppose you could say, oh, listen, somebody is plucking a bunch of brass strings. But I would hope it is more likely that you would say, oh, someone is playing music. There is some sort of additional added meaning that has been created by the organization of the sounds. Now, The person who creates the actual sounds, the person who plucks the strings, or plays an instrument, or sings, or even possibly waves his hand at a sensor connected to a computer. Okay? This person, I'm looking for a smile over there. This person is called the performer. The one who produces actual sounds is the performer. The person who makes the organization, the person who creates the pattern to which those sounds are supposed to conform, this person we call the composer. So we have this dichotomy. Performer is actually making sounds, actualizing. The composer is creating a concept, an idea, which is the arrangement of the sounds. It is, however, not quite as straightforward as that, because there is a sort of gray area in between. It will perhaps have happened that you have heard two different people at different times performing the same piece. And they're not quite the same. They're not exactly alike. And one of them does the piece a little bit differently than the other. Okay, maybe they feel it differently. So clearly what's going on is the performer is adding something to the organization of the sounds. They're making some kind of change. They are not composing, perhaps, but they are, let's say, using the composition as a template. They have some wiggle room to make some distinctions. We still recognize the piece as being the same piece in both cases. But what we say is that these people are interpreting the music in a different way. Okay? There are different forms of musical interpretation. There can be, for example, as we have said here, a personal interpretation. There can be interpretation according to genre. We talk about this thing called style. You don't play rock music the same way you play jazz. They have a different style. You don't play Bach as though it was Chopin. Or perhaps in Egypt, frequently you do play Bach as though it was Chopin. Not everywhere. These things, this is the way we used to always play Bach. As I will explain, there are interesting questions to be posed about style in history. Let us suppose that we have a Western musician who is presented with this piece of music. As you see, it is a duet. And this Western musician, we will say, looks at it and says, well, I don't know anything about Arab music, but I certainly know how to read music. And there it is. So the Western musician would sit down at an instrument and play something like and so forth. An Arab musician might hear that and would certainly recognize what the piece is. But the Arab musician might draw some objections to this particular performance. First of all, of course, the objection would be that there's a note that's wrong, because you know there is one of these famous half flats that we use in Arab repertory, and you can't play it on that instrument. Right? The Western musician is coming as close as they can. But there is more to it than that, because the Arab musician would look at this and then probably not look at it, because it's a pretty well-known piece, and they would just play. kinds of stuff. There are notes you're playing that are not there, and the Arab musician would respond, well, it's not what's there, but that's not the music. This is the music. Arab music is a style, and you have to play in that style. And that may not be what is written down note for note, but that is what that means. And in order to know that, you have to learn about the style of Arab music. Okay? Now, this presents a problem. If you want to learn about Arab music, you could, for example, 20 years ago, take a job in Egypt and come and listen to lots and lots of Arab music in taxi cabs and eventually take lessons and learn, right? Steep yourself in the repertory, and then you learn about the style. Because there are people who are alive who are playing music in this style. What do you do if the music was written 300 years ago? That's a problem. You can say, well, we have the written music, there it is. And in point of fact, if you look at the score, it is by Francois Couperin, and he is a contemporary of Bach, so it's about 300 years old. You can actually read all of those notes. My dear students, I do want to point out to you that that is in fact an alto clef on the top staff, which we are now learning. There's a point to it, right? Okay. You can in fact read the notes, and I will in a minute. But the fact of the matter is, as we know, that sometimes not everything is written in. If you were to read a contemporary account of, let's say, a British ambassador visiting Egypt and having meetings with the ruler of Egypt, you might say that the account might say that the ambassador went in and had dinner with the Egyptian ruler. The account probably would not say that they sat down on chairs at a table and ate with silverware. And yet the fact of the matter is that that same account from 300 years ago also would mention it, but the fact is they would not have sat down on chairs at a table, and they would not have used silverware. There are things you mention, and there are things you don't mention because we just know them. Okay? Right? But unfortunately, if we weren't there 300 years ago, we don't just know them. We can sometimes deduce that they are there. Okay? Someone who is not schooled in the performance of Baroque music would look at this and play something like this. Even a person who takes sufficient interest to do a piece like this, and there are many of them now, there were not so many about 50 years ago. If you knew about this piece, you knew that it was in this book by the composer, in which he gives instructions on how to play the harpsichord. And he remarks here about this particular kind of piece called a prelude. He says, although these preludes are written in measured time, there is nonetheless a tasteful custom of bourgeoisage, which should be followed. I will explain. A prelude is a composition in which the fancy can free itself from all that is written in the book. It is necessary for those who will resort to the regulated preludes to play them freely without attaching too much precision to the movement. So what does that mean exactly? Well, I can tell you how I would play this piece. In fact, let me play it for you. It's not long. sense to me. I think it makes a compelling performance. But I have no idea if that is the way that Francois Couperin played it 300 years ago. I think I can justify, I can either think about it and argue as to why I move when I move and how I am shaping the various phrases in the piece. But you know, here is a little cautionary data point to consider. One of the very earliest recordings of music that we have, Victrola recordings, an Edison Victrola recording, was made with a somewhat undersized orchestra in Europe. They had to squeeze them all into a small space, you know, which was conducted by Artur Nikisch. It was a performance of a movement of a Brahms symphony. Now, we know that Brahms loved Nikisch's performance of his music. He thought he was a fabulous interpreter of his music. You listen to the recording, and to a modern ear, it sounds bizarre. Okay? He starts the piece, and then about, I don't know, 12 measures before he gets to the second theme, he begins to make a retard. And he's about 30 metronome points slower when he gets to the second theme. It's not written anywhere in the music. Nowhere does it say that you should do this. And yet he is making these enormous changes in tempo in the course of playing the piece. To a modern ear, it sounds right over the top. It sounds like a gross exaggeration of, you know, how we conceive of the romantic flexibility. Now, it may be that if we lived in that era, or if enough people started doing that now, we'd get used to it, we'd get used to hearing it this way, and it would make sense for us. There's no question, however, that musical taste is, to a certain extent, a matter of fashion. It is something which is learned. Right? So, when we do a piece from the Baroque, there was a time when we just didn't worry about things, we just played everything the same way because it made sense for us. In the last 50 or 60 years, there has been a very active movement called the early music movement, in which they tried to reconstruct what they called authentic performances, find out what is the quote-unquote intention of the composer, and do it the way they did it. But you know what? You can't really know what is the intention of the composer. That was then. Okay? And I have this uncomfortable notion that maybe if we could hear the way that Bach performed his own music, maybe we wouldn't like it as much as the way that we do it. Because a lot has happened between now and then. And now, we are speaking to a different audience with different oral memories. Okay? There are further problems that come with trying to perform music from way long ago. One of the reasons I love to work on early music performance is there's a certain amount of detective work involved. The further back you go looking at the music, the less we actually understand what is written on the page. This is a page of a manuscript of an Italian song. This is called Laude Spirituali, Laude Spirituali. This was a repertory which was the most popular song in Italy in the medieval and even in the early Renaissance period. This is one of the earliest manuscripts. They didn't actually read the music. They knew it by heart and they sang it. We have about 200 books from these companies, these Laudesi companies, who were essentially archiving. They wanted to preserve their songs so that people would know that these were the songs we sang. 198 of these books have no music in them, just the words. Fortunately, there were two companies that were so proud of their stuff that they actually found a guy who could write music, which they didn't know how to do, and put it in. And there it is. So there's a difficulty. We know what the words are. We know what the pitches are, pretty much. We don't know how to read this rhythm. number of different theories. I once gave this very piece to a very fine British singer who said, oh, I can read this notation, not to worry. She brought it in and she sang, pitch. Cristo è nato et umanato per salvar la gente. She essentially treated it as though it were chant. She made every note equal. I am not convinced at all by this. I mean, chant is fine for chant. Even chant, I don't perform it the way the English do. God bless them. I have also heard a recorded performance of this very piece. We know that when they did these services together, where they sang many of these laudes, sometimes they were rather sedate, sometimes they were quite active. There could even be dance involved. And I did once hear a recording. I went. Cristo è nato et umanato per salvar la gente che era perduta ed escaduta nel primer parente. Now the problem with this is it doesn't work when you get to the verses. Nato e Cristo. I'm not convinced. I mean, it gets more elaborated and you can't quite fit the notes to the words in it. So what do you do with it? Well, I live with it for a while. I contemplate the words, I think about the rhythm, the text rhythm, the music, and how it is laid out. This is the performance that I came up for this piece. Cristo è nato et umanato per salvar la gente era perduta ed escaduta nel primer parente. Nato è Cristo per fare acquisto de noi peccatori, eran partiti e dispartiti dai suoi servidori. So if you ask me, is that how they performed it? The correct answer is no idea. We don't know. When we do early music, we can kid ourselves, we can pretend that we are actually doing it the way that it was done. Okay? It's a fib. Okay? What we are in fact doing is we are making a creative reconstruction of an earlier repertoire. It's the most we can do. Okay? Do it with love. Sell, make the music work, make it a compelling performance. It becomes more complicated yet when you have more than one person performing at a time. My favorite question that I have ever been asked by a student at the American University in Cairo, it was, I think, my third semester teaching at AUC, and I was introducing the orchestra to an introduction to music class. And a very bright young man said, Dr. John, what's with the guy with the stick? I wanted to make that the title of this talk. What's with the guy with the stick? And I decided to go for dull but informative instead. I am the guy with the stick. And we do in fact have a purpose in life. There really is a reason for having a conductor. It came into being in the first place because if you have a large group of people, you do need someone to give a signal so they can all start at the same time. Would you all please say the word ta? I want you to say it absolutely together. Go ahead. Ta. Yeah. Okay. Now, would you look at me And let's say it together.
Da.
That's a little better. You were being actually very attentive, and you picked up the prep. Okay. I am now going to ask you to say a ta on each beat, and maybe I'll do something with the beat. If you would use Welsh. Here we go. And.
Ta. 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 Ta.
So, a conductor can in fact be a traffic cop. The conductor can make things go faster and slower, louder and softer. What, however, eventually we determined by the late 19th century is that a conductor can actually do a lot more than that. The conductor can in fact interpret the music. The conductor, think of it this way, if you think of time as a dimension, the conductor creates a four-dimensional shape, a shape that changes in time, which looks like what the piece is supposed to sound like. Chew on that for a moment. I was once, I used to teach at Illinois State University, and by what I think was a complete coincidence, a wonderful experiment, unintentional experiment, took place. A bunch of my faculty colleagues, teachers in the music department, decided they would do a performance of the Carnival of the Animals. They had about 16 players, it was a piano, they were all together. They rehearsed it together and they performed it without conductor. In the same semester, the conductor of the student orchestra did a performance of the Carnival of the Animals. He did it with students. I saw both performances. The teachers were extremely better individually. They were each much more capable of playing their instrument. They were professionals. And yet, by far, the student performance was the more interesting. It was the more musical. It made more sense. It went places and did things. Because there was one person, not even perhaps, he's a pretty good conductor, but there was one person who was indicating an interpretation, a shape. And so they all conformed to it. Whereas when you have a whole bunch of musicians working together at the same time, they kind of cancel each other out, unless there is one person, right, to give that sort of. So this is a performance of the AUC Chamber Singers. These are students, AUC students. You too could sing in the AUC Chamber Singers, right? And you will see that the tempo is constantly changing. Okay, it is my job to make sure that they stay absolutely together. It often happens that if you look at what the conductor is doing, they will bring your attention to whatever is the most important thing that's supposed to be going on. Okay? Happens a lot. In this case, this is the Cairo Festival Orchestra, a professional orchestra, and we are performing a movement of a Handel Concerto Grosso. Follow where the stick goes. So, when I first came to Egypt, I had just spent about 25 years teaching, conducting, directing ensembles, early music ensembles, and performing ensembles. Then I came here and started teaching a lot of introduction to music, and instead of just playing sonatas, I started actually teaching the sonatas. And I got really interested in that form, and I decided to write a piano sonata. And I had written one in my 20s. I wrote one again in 2007, wrote it for a very, very good American pianist who came here and played it. And I just want to play for you the beginning. What's going on here is that I am taking a classical form. Okay? There's an opposition of two ideas that makes up what's called the exposition, and then the exposition repeats, then it develops, and then there's a recap at the end. So I will play you the exposition with its repeat. And what you will hear, I hope, is that I am taking a modern musical language and pouring it into a very classical, Mozartian even, form, structure. kind of old-fashioned and I don't have time to wait. So I'm interested maybe in trying to make stuff happen right away. And what I ended up doing is combining minimalist techniques with the sonata form. And that's what I used for the first movement of my bassoon concerto. The bassoon concerto was performed in the Opera House. I performed it again with the Festival Orchestra. Right now, I don't have a good recording. Okay, we might be able to prepare one. So what I'm going to do today, with apologies, is to play for you a sampled orchestra performing this piece. I'll show you the score. It's not terrible if you don't pretend that it's a real orchestra. You know, it's clear, it's in and you can hear all the entrances. So there's the score, and here's the piece. certain classical Arab forms lend themselves very well to symphonic treatment. Okay? The Samai Sakil is very like a Western rondo. Okay? Okay? A rondo is a piece in which there's a block of music called a ritornello. You get the ritornello, then you get something different, and then the ritornello comes back, and in between the ritornello you get different blocks of other material. Semi-sakil works exactly the same way, except it doesn't begin with the ritornello. The ritornello is called a taslim, okay? And so you get a khana in the correct mode, makam. Then you get the taslim. Then you get another khana which is in a different mode, and then the taslim comes back. And it keeps alternating this way. The last khana is in a snappier meter, okay? And then it finishes. So in both of my symphonies, there is an inner movement which is a semi-sakil, and I will share with you. This is about 6 minutes long, so I'm going to let it play out, and then if you're still here and you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them. This is the second movement of my first symphony, and it is in the form of semi-sakil.
Latin music, how do we know for sure that they were notating pitch, not something else like volume or?
The lines and spaces?
Yes.
It's a complicated answer. The notation started out without lines at all. It was a mnemonic. And someone got the bright idea of adding a line and putting a letter next to it. We know from reading the theory at the time that the letters were the names of pitches. Okay, so they started out with, this should sound vaguely familiar, a G line, a C line, and an F line. What a funny coincidence that is. And then a very bright guy named Dino D'Arezzo started adding other lines and spaces in between, and then we ended up with the lines as well.
Yeah, I have a question about your compositional practice. And often you still work with symphonic sonata, these terminologies still come up. And I'm wondering why, given the period of time we're in, you still use these forms in your musical practice.
Because I'm just a stodgy guy. What it comes down to, it is, I mean, those of you who do not know David Rafferty, my distinguished colleague, who is an avant-garde composer of considerable merit, and a pleasure to have him actually balancing our department. In fact, we have another composer here as well this afternoon, and a guest coming likewise. You know, you have to work in the genre that speaks to you, right? And as a conductor who's constantly doing older repertory, earlier repertories, I see things in them and I want to do them, and I want to work with them. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, obviously I'm not writing 515, you know. But I also grew up kind of with a chip on my shoulder about Schoenberg and his crew. You know, when I was your age, when I was quite young, all you could do was atonal music. 12-tone ruled the roost. And, you know, I wrote a few pieces, 12-tone pieces, and I said, great, so what? You know, it didn't really, I was putting myself through a hoop that I did not find conducive to really, you know, I mean, composition is hard enough, you know. I just found, and I always, you know, hinted at Bartok, that style of composition, Stravinsky appealed to me more than the other side.
That makes sense actually now you describe those characters because the pitch content that you're using in your example with the sonata and the minimalist example.
Sure.
I see
lots of fourths, lots of, you know.
You're branching out for sure, like you're definitely experimenting with the pitch content.
But it is in fact, there's always a tonal centaur usually.
Okay.
So yes. Mark.
Yes. Actually, I love this Joe Cage and Copland moment. It's really lovely. Actually, I called this a tonal influence or effect in the sonata. Speaking about this, you liking the tonal composition earlier. The sonata sounded like a little bit, there is an echo of a tonal music or a Schoenbergian echo or something. Am I right on that?
The one that I really admire in this connection, I don't know if you know the Copland variations.
Yes,
The
of
Copland
course.
sonata
Yeah.
also.
It was
Copland actually came to Haverford College when I was went behind the ears undergraduate. I got to actually, you know, shake the great man's hand and talk to him. And William Masellis came and played the piece, right, while I was at this little tiny, you know, liberal arts college. It was really quite remarkable. You know, we are what we eat. We are what we listen to.
Yeah.
It comes down to it, right?
Amen for that.
It really was shaping what we think about this.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little about what made the one that you showed us, you showed the score coming past. What made that minimalist? I mean, how did that connect with minimalism?
Minimalism is about taking little units and repeating them over and over again. And in different parts, you have that repetition, and sometimes they're different lengths in the different parts, and you get this sort of kaleidoscopic effect. That is what I'm doing a lot of the time in this piece. And after a repetition, actually at the very beginning of the first movement, after 5 beats, another thing comes in, and then after 5 beats, another thing comes in. Just it builds in this
Okay,
way.
so it's
really is what makes it, and there has to be a development through that repetition, and sometimes everything changes at once, sometimes it changes gradually. You alter things as, in the course of, you'll do a few repetitions and then it will change slightly, okay, and then it will evolve. Minimalist music is a pain in the neck to write. I have not written very much because it takes forever. That one movement took like 7 years.
Wow.
That's the one that I brought to, I wrote about the first, 3 minutes. And I said, I'm not going to do this unless we're actually going to do something with it. And the bassoonist and I went to visit with Inés Sacrodaya, who was at that time the head of the orchestra. I finished it. I have done some minimalist things elsewhere, but mostly I just stick with sonata or things like that. So semi-secular.
You said that music style is partly a fashion, and so my question to you is, how can we take this rich repertoire that is not really that does not really have the fashion of this time and this culture, and how can we make it more appealing and more reachable to today's culture?
The secret to a successful performance is to perform the music in such a way that it sounds like it has never been performed before. It sounds like you are composing it as you perform it, that you're improvising it on the spot. Okay? Music, this is kind of a Chestertonian concept that we cannot be lulled into thinking that extraordinary things are normal. Right? If the stars went out and we didn't have them from a year, boy, would we appreciate them when they came back again. We'd look at that and say, my God, look at that. Well, you should go out every night and say, my God, look at that. And that is our job as artists, is to somehow make the music work in such a way that when we see it, it's as though we're hearing it for the first time. You can do that really with any repertoire, if there is merit. I mean, there is such a thing as bad music. There is no hope for bad music. Now, if it's good music, then we should be able to perform it in such a way that we can create a compelling performance. Okay? The secret to that is not necessarily doing it exactly the way that the composer did it, even if the composer is Beethoven. Very often, most of the time, it's going to help us to find out how the composer did it, because likely he knows more about what makes that music work than you and I do. Right? So it is very worthwhile to do a study of what's called performance practice, really music study. Okay? But that is a means, not an end. Other questions?
Okay. What quantifies, in your opinion, bad or good music? What's an objective metric to decide whether it's good or bad?
An objective metric to decide whether the music is good or bad. I normally weigh it out in pounds. I know over here you prefer the what's it called, the kilogram system. The correct answer to your question is I can sit down and it's like when I played my unmeasured version of. I could perhaps sit down and play something which was completely chaotic and meaningless. It would be unmeasured.
Yeah.
Okay? What is it exactly that makes it chaotic and meaningless? I'm not sure. I can say, for example, I make a slight acceleration toward the cadence, and then after the cadence I make a slight retard. Okay? And you do that over and over again, and it sort of makes sense. But I don't know why it makes sense. I'm not sure.
Well,
ultimately, there are certain physical facts that we do in fact rely on. There is consonance and there is dissonance. And we know that when you go to a scary horror movie and the hero is walking into the dark house, you get scared. And the reason you get scared is that there's lots of dissonance in the music. Right? It causes a physical reaction. We do have that to work with. We do have such a thing as tonal centers. Okay? But that's not much to go on in terms of actually creating an aesthetic for music.
when you answered the question, you said that some bad. What does that mean to you?
Nadim, what does it mean to you when you say that you are in love with someone?
I've never been in love. So.
Well, I think we all know what the word love means,
Yeah.
right? I think I have a sense for what is music that works and music that does not work. I have made mistakes before. I have listened to, when I was, about 20, which means I was much smarter than I am now, and much smarter than just about anybody that I read into that knew anything about music. Okay? I knew that Berlioz was a fraud. I knew that Berlioz was not a very good composer. And I did, in fact, change my opinion after.
So it's subjective.
I didn't like Berlioz, I didn't like Mendelssohn, and, you'll learn about these things, right?
Sorry, why did you think Berlioz was a fraud?
Because it was just evident. It was obvious that he had no idea what he was doing. He didn't even know how to write a chord progression. I'll tell you what's interesting. My
What
dear,
about the operas?
may he rest in peace, David Hales actually did not care very much for Berlioz. Because of the way that he thought about music and harmony and how harmony works. Berlioz was an extraordinary composer. Extraordinary. But I needed to be a little bit older and wiser and more mature to actually figure that out and figure out what it was. You know the story about Mark Twain, who remarks on the fact that when he was 16, his father was just a boor, was just someone he couldn't stand having him around. And he was just astonished when he got to be about 24 or so that the man had improved so much. I guess music was that. Yes?
When you are conducting, you are so much enthusiastic with the people who are playing the instruments and for your choir. What about the audience? Do you have certain sense about?
It is a very strange thing that sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. You're always a live performance. You always know that the audience is there, and very often you have a sense for what they are thinking, what they are feeling about the music and how it works. Of course, it works better when you face them. Interesting fact, when conductors first became a thing, they did not face the orchestra, they faced the audience. We have pictures of Mendelssohn, for example, standing and he's facing the audience and and the orchestra's behind him. And somehow they're following him. Like that's what he's doing. Carl Maria von Weber, we have pictures of him doing the same thing, drawing pictures. Strange thing. Other questions? Problems, complaints? Thank you so much for coming this afternoon.